Responsible AI is the practice of mitigating harms that can potentially occur in AI systems. Today, we're going to deep dive into the potential harm and issue of bias in generative AI systems. Welcome to the Talk to Me PDD podcast. I'm your host, PDD, where we talk about all things knowledge work, AI, tech and society, people management, leadership, whatever's top of mind. So today, we're on episode number 36. Why generative AI systems are biased. Now, if you like this content, this is based on a longer form article that I wrote. It's available on my website, peterdempseywrites.com. If you sign up for the newsletter there, you'll get direct access to longer articles. It's sometimes hard to get them out in the audience through other channels. Also, welcome to follow me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. Please like and subscribe to YouTube channel or podcasts wherever you listen to me. So thank you again, and welcome to today's topic. So as we get into this, it's important to understand there are two concepts or fields of AI systems. And many of us today are only hearing about generative AI, but it's good to compare and contrast the two types of systems. So the first one I'll get into, which is not generative AI, is symbolic AI, where you're trying to make computer systems that can make decisions based on human intelligence or a simulation of that intelligence or a certain domain, but you're doing it based on rules that human programmers or human system builders define. So if you were looking at making a symbolic AI system to handle language, you would need to encode things like grammar, sentence structure, that sort of thing, and you would do it explicitly. And if you had a set of rules that captured everything you needed to know about language, the system would work just fine. On the other side, you have deep learning, and this is where generative AI falls into. So you don't give it any rules, you give it a large amount of data, and it's able to extrapolate rules from that. So for example, you have the same problem. You want a deep learning system to be able to understand language and language rules. You just give it a massive amount of content that uses that language and those language rules. So in the case of generative AI, it's the internet and books and whatever these companies can get their hands on to train their systems on. And actually in language, that can be a pretty good approach, because while you may have a lot of standard rules about grammar and sentence structure, there's lots of edge cases. There's different ways that people write. Sometimes you have poetic license, you break rules on purpose. And if you're trying to encode those in rules that you're writing out as a subject matter expert, it can be challenging. They all sort of have to nest and work with each other and not overwrite each other. And as you get into this long tail of what can happen with language, it can be really difficult to encode those. So just being able to have a system that can learn that or see those patterns and then sort of generate rules, it's an incredibly powerful way to solve that type of problem. So some of these systems are good in certain domains and some are good in other domains. Now, what's great about symbolic AI is you can look at it and you can understand, oh, these are the rules. This is exactly why this system did a particular thing. Not so easy, or not really possible, to do that with deep learning systems. The way that they represent the quote unquote rules about their data is not something that's easy for humans to read or to understand. There is a field of mechanistic interpretation that attempts to do that, but it's not an exact science, and there's still some work to do there. It's hard. So it's hard to understand why deep learning systems do what they do. So because deep learning systems are simply building a set of rules to match what they see in the data that they're trained upon, if there is bias in the data that they're training, they will find rules that translate into biased outcomes. That's just the way they work. It's not based on any sort of value system or anything like that. They're just trying to find a way to faithfully reproduce the outcomes that they see in their data. And we saw this in some early AI systems, and I mentioned this in the article. So there were some image generators that would generate offensive content. So if you typed in something like juvenile delinquents, the vast majority of the time you'd get images of young black males with ankle bracelets and things like that. And it wasn't because the AI system, was racist in and of itself. It was representing racist outcomes in the data itself that it was trained upon. So that's something that in some ways you could look at a positive, because we may be forced to confront some of these biases that exist systemically in our societies when we see them play out in AI systems like that. But obviously, this is harmful if this gets out into sort of production applications. Now, I think you'll see that in most major AI tools and models that are out there, they've mitigated obvious bias like this, and it doesn't show up that often, or at least in obvious ways. Now, kind of moving on to a little bit more subtle aspect of how bias can show up in Gen AI systems and training data is, as humans, we can reason a little bit about what might be causal in a data and what might just be correlation. Gen AI systems can't do that. So there was an example of a candidate assessment AI tool for job applicants that would look at a video interview. You could imagine that this podcast, was an interview, and it's sort of analyzing what I'm saying, and it has been trained on a list of existing interviews for candidates that had particular outcomes, and it's going to map features of that interview and try to correlate that with candidates that had successful outcomes. One of the things that it had learned is that if, like me, you have a bookshelf in the background, you would be rated as a more successful candidate. Now, obviously, just putting books behind me doesn't mean I'm going to be a more successful candidate for a position, but there happened to be a correlation in the training data between candidates that had successful outcomes in a role and that they happen to have books in their background. So there's no separation between what happens to be there as a correlation and what is actually causing an outcome. So that's another way that you can see bias based on what shows up in the training data. Now, it's not just data that can introduce bias in generative AI behavior. After these systems are trained kind of on the data itself, there's usually some post-training and tuning for different outcomes that can happen. One of the things that I thought was interesting is a paper that OpenAI released recently trying to talk about why quote-unquote hallucination happens, why Gen AI systems may be prone to making things up or guessing for answers. And they correlated this with how some of the tuning was done. A lot of these AI systems are measured on benchmarks that are standardized tests. Usually on a standardized test, you're not penalized for getting things wrong. So if it's a multiple choice or any sort of question and you have time, you're better off answering something because you have a chance that you could get it right or get some credit, and you're not going to be penalized, versus saying, oh, I don't know, and just leaving it blank. So because of that behavioral tuning to try and be a better test taker, the theory is that drove those systems to guess more because it's in their best interest to take a guess, and there's a chance that they'll get it right, and they'll certainly better at their scores in the tests that they're taking. So that's another way that bias can show up in these systems. Now, there's also the aspect of cultural bias. Within every culture, there's naturally some bias that you could say is represented by those cultural values, that you have preferences for certain types of things over others. Now, in terms of the large language models that we have available today, those are only coming from a very small number of companies and generally representing a particular worldview or culture or geographic area. There's some interesting graphs that sort of show this and show the data that's there and what countries or languages it corresponds to. So you're going to have those cultural values in your data as well that will be represented in the Gen AI system's output. And depending on what your own cultural values are or the ones that you want to show up in systems that you're building, that's going to be influenced by the model itself. Now, there can be some variation in this. For example, you look at how Grok was built to sort of be, an anti-woke model or take some of the culture of wokeness out of it. That was, a design choice there. So some of these have slightly different cultures that they represent, and you can, choose within those limited cultures what you want to have for your system, but there's not a whole lot of variation or ways to tune that at a model level to what your own particular culture is or the culture of your audience. We don't really understand how we get particular outputs from the data. And one of the concerns there is that, yes, overwhelmingly, you're going to capture these certain cultures and experiences and types of output from looking at data overall. But especially thinking about the internet, there's all sorts of extreme and fringe cultures on the internet, and those might be lost in the overall output of the model. But because we don't understand exactly how it's generating things, there may be particular inputs that could tap into those and generate output that is totally misaligned from the overall culture of the model. So let's say there's some kind of coded words that a particular subculture uses. If you're putting those in your prompts, maybe that pushes the probabilistic output to generate something aligned with that specific culture that's buried in the model that's really hard for us to see. So that's another potential risk there. And it's hard to test for all of these things because the output is probabilistic. Even with the same inputs, you're not going to get exactly the same output every time. So you have to run multiple tests, and then you have to look at the distribution of your output and see what the probability is that certain types of things are going to occur. So it's a lot of work to validate that you're not getting output that's biased in a different direction than what you would like. It's not as simple as just running one test. When you're deploying these systems into production scenarios that are working with people or areas that you're concerned about bias, I think if you can, eliminating any of that data that can potentially push to bias is a good idea if possible. I mean, even things like people's names of institutions, geographic locations, which you would normally, like thinking about the job application assessment, those are things that you would normally look at in a resume. And we know that there's human bias for, prestigious institutions, things like that. There's going to be similar bias in AI systems. So if you can eliminate that, I think it'll make it in general, a less biased output and system. So I think that's something that's worth testing as you're building these systems. But also, we need to recognize that we don't fully understand how these biases can show up and how to mitigate them in all cases, even if we're doing it in a very general way. So I think it's right to be careful of building systems that have potential determination on people's outcomes in biased ways, or at least in ways that we're not 100% confident will be unbiased. So we as system builders should keep that in mind. And then also as consumers of these products, we should be aware of when there may be potential harms and try and avoid those if possible. So there you go, a little bit of a deep dive into why bias is an integral part, sort of a feature of these probabilistic generative AI systems. And we're doing our best to mitigate them and being aware of those biases, but we're not there yet. And it's something that we need to continue to be careful of and cognizant of. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it'll help you eliminate bias in applications and in your life.